Liora, cloaked and trembling, is being escorted by grim-faced knights through the massive torch-lit gates of a formidable castle. A powerful, commanding voice echoes from the throne room. "Bring her to me." Liora's heart hammers against her ribs, her simple life as a healer shattered. She had saved a man, not a king, but now she was a captive in his world of cold stone and colder ambition. Was the love she felt for the man in the cottage a lie, or was it the only thing that could save them both from the darkness to come? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The world rewound, snapping back to a time of quiet solitude. To a life measured in seasons and sunlight. Liora Hale lived a life nestled between the known world and the forgotten one. Her small cottage, a sturdy structure of fieldstone and timber, was tucked into the edge of the Whisper Wood, a mist-shrouded forest that locals spoke of with a mixture of fear and reverence. Above her home, clinging to the rugged hills, loomed the skeletal remains of an ancient fortress, crumbling ruins that were said to be haunted by the ghosts of a long-dead king and his lost dynasty. Liora, however, felt no fear of the stones or the spirits they supposedly held. They were simply a part of her landscape, silent companions to her solitary existence. Inside her cottage, the air was a tapestry of scents woven from her trade. The dominant notes were the earthy, floral fragrances of drying herbs, lavender for calm, chamomile for sleep, and willow bark for pain, which hung in fragrant bundles from the wooden beams overhead. On the hearth, a small cauldron of some potent concoction bubbled softly, releasing a thin, sweet-smelling steam that mingled with the wood smoke from the fire. Shelves, meticulously organized, lined every wall, crowded with glass jars of every shape and size. They held shimmering poultices, dark salves, and tinctures that caught the light like liquid jewels. The atmosphere was one of profound peace, an enclave of healing carved out of the wilderness. Liora was the heart of this quiet world, a young woman whose gentle hands and compassionate spirit belied a deep, unyielding resilience. She had been alone since her parents, healers like her, had been taken by a fever years ago. They had left her their knowledge, their cottage, and a loneliness that had shaped her as much as their love had. Her days followed a familiar rhythm, dictated by the needs of her garden and the wild bounty of the forest. This morning, she was foraging near the ruins, her movements practiced and sure as she moved through the overgrown paths. Her basket was already filling with rare herbs that only grew in the shadow of the ancient stones, their roots clinging to the history sleeping beneath the soil. She felt a deep connection to this place, an empathy that extended from the smallest wildflower to the great, weathered stones of the dead fortress. It was this empathy that made her a gifted healer. This ability to feel the subtle pulse of life in all things, to understand its fragility and its fierce desire to endure. She paused, her fingers brushing against a patch of silver leaf, its leaves shimmering in the dappled sunlight. A sense of contentment washed over her, a quiet joy in the simplicity and purpose of her life. She knew nothing of the world of men, of their wars and their ambitions, and she wanted nothing of it. Her world was here, in the rustle of leaves, the scent of herbs, and the silent hum of life that surrounded her. The peace was shattered by the sky itself. The afternoon sun vanished, swallowed by a bruised purple mass of clouds that rolled in from the contested valley to the east. The wind began to howl, tearing at the leaves of the Whisper Wood, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the stones of the ruins. A violent thunderstorm, born of the turbulent air over the borderlands, was about to break. As the heavens opened, another sound reached her, carried on the gusts of wind. It was a distant, muffled clamor, a chaotic symphony of clashing steel and the faint, desperate cries of men. Liora's heart clenched with a familiar dread. The valley was a place of constant strife, a bloody chessboard for the ambitions of rival kingdoms. She had seen the aftermath of these skirmishes before, the broken bodies and the grieving earth. She hurried back to her cottage, her basket clutched tight, the precious herbs forgotten. Inside, she barred the door and stoked the fire. Its warm glow a feeble defense against the growing storm and the chilling sounds from the valley. The thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of her small home, and in its wake, the sounds of battle seemed to grow louder, more distinct. She could almost imagine the glint of swords, the splintering of shields, the raw, brutal reality of it all. Her first instinct was to hide, to block out the sounds and pretend the world beyond her forest didn't exist. She was a healer, not a warrior. Her place was with the living, not the dying. But her healer's oath, a promise made to her parents and to herself, was a heavy weight in her soul. It was a vow to preserve life wherever it was found, however faint its flicker. As the sounds of fighting slowly died down, replaced by the eerie, unnatural silence of the aftermath, a new conflict began within her. Fear warred with compassion, self-preservation with duty. The silence was worse than the noise. It was the sound of death, of lives extinguished, of pain left untended. She knew she could not stay hidden. Her conscience, her very nature, would not allow it. With a deep, steadying breath, she unbarred the door and stepped out into the storm. Venturing onto the battlefield was like stepping into a nightmare. Dusk was falling, and the rain had turned the ground into a treacherous sea of mud and blood. The air was thick with the metallic scent of slaughter, mingled with the clean smell of rain and damp earth. Her lantern, its flame flickering wildly in the wind, cast a small, dancing circle of light on the carnage. The bodies of fallen soldiers lay strewn across the field, their armor glinting dully in the gloom. Liora moved carefully, her boots sinking into the mud, her eyes scanning the grim tableau for any sign of life. She felt a profound sorrow for these men, strangers who had died far from their homes for a cause she could not comprehend. She was about to turn back, her heart heavy with the futility of her search, when she saw it, a flicker of movement near a thicket of trees at the edge of the field, away from the main slaughter, her breath caught in her throat. She raised her lantern, its light cutting through the deepening shadows, and saw him. He was lying half-submerged in the mud, his body unnaturally still. He was large, powerfully built, and clad in battered leather armor of a quality she had never seen before. It was unmarked, bearing no sigil or banner to identify his allegiance. A deep, grievous wound in his side bled profusely, staining the mud around him a dark, sickening red. A nasty gash on his temple oozed blood, matting his dark hair. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Even in his broken state, there was an aura of command about him, an almost palpable sense of power that set him apart from the other fallen soldiers. He was not just another casualty of war. She knew it instinctively. He was something more. For a moment, she hesitated. Saving him would be a monumental risk. He was a warrior, a man of violence, and bringing him into her peaceful world could have unforeseen consequences. But as she looked at his face, pale and still in the lantern light, she saw not a warrior, but a man on the brink of death. Her healer's instinct took over, eclipsing all fear and doubt. She could not leave him here to die. Making the decision was one thing, acting on it was another. He was incredibly heavy, his muscular frame a dead weight in the clinging mud. Dragging him back to her cottage was a monumental struggle, a desperate, grueling battle against the mud, the rain, and her own exhaustion. Her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned, but she refused to give up. Every step was an act of will, a testament to her determination. Finally, sobbing with effort, she managed to drag him across the threshold of her cottage and bar the door against the storm and the world of death she had left behind. Inside the sanctuary of her cottage, Liora worked with a frantic, focused energy. The man, this stranger, lay on a pallet of furs before the fire, his life hanging by a thread. She cut away his blood-soaked tunic with her sharpest shears, her hands moving with practiced skill. The wound in his side was even worse than she had feared, a deep, ragged tear that had narrowly missed his vital organs. Her stomach churned, but she pushed her revulsion aside. She cleaned the wound meticulously, her touch gentle but firm, and then, with a steady hand, she began to stitch the torn flesh back together. The needle, fine and curved, flashed in the firelight as she worked, her movements precise and economical. While the water for cleaning the wound was heating, she moved to her shelves, her mind already racing ahead, planning her next steps. She took down a stone mortar and pestle and began to grind a mixture of yarrow to stop the bleeding and comfrey root to knit the flesh. The rhythmic thump of the pestle was a steady counterpoint to the howling of the wind outside. She mixed the ground herbs with a little honey to create a thick, fragrant poultice, which she applied carefully to the stitched wound before binding it with clean linen. Next, she brewed a strong tea from willow bark and feverfew, a potent brew to fight the fever she knew would soon take hold. As she worked, she allowed herself to study him, this man she had pulled from the jaws of death. His face, even pale and etched with pain, was handsome in a rugged, uncompromising way. A sharp jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that seemed set in a permanent line of command. A thin, white scar bisected one of his dark eyebrows, a testament to some past battle. His hands, resting limply at his sides, were calloused and scarred from wielding a sword, yet they lacked the brutish, clumsy quality she had seen in other warriors. There was a strange, almost elegant strength in them. In his fevered, restless sleep, he began to murmur, his voice a low, rough rasp. The words were incoherent, fragments of command and loss, spoken in a tone of absolute authority. A strange, inexplicable pull tugged at her heart, a confusing mixture of pity for his suffering, curiosity about his past, and a nascent, dangerous attraction. He was a mystery, a puzzle she both feared and longed to solve. He had no name to give, no past to share. So in the quiet of her own mind, she gave him one. She would call him Lucien. The name settled in her mind, a soft, quiet thing, but the man himself was anything but. His peace was short-lived. By nightfall, the fever she had dreaded took hold, gripping him with a ferocious intensity. The cottage, her sanctuary of calm, transformed into a crucible where life and death wrestled. Lucien thrashed on the pallet, his powerful body slick with sweat. His muscles coiled in agony. He was no longer the still, broken man from the battlefield, but a tempest of pain and memory, lost in a delirious nightmare. Liora was constantly by his side, a small, determined figure against the storm of his suffering. Her own exhaustion was a dull ache in her bones, a fog in her mind, but she pushed it away. She changed his dressings, her heart sinking each time she saw the angry red that crept around the edges of the stitches. She forced sips of the bitter willow bark tea past his clenched teeth, murmuring soft words of encouragement that he could not hear. When the heat from his skin became so intense it felt like touching a furnace, she bathed his face and chest with cool, lavender-scented water, her small acts of care a desperate prayer against the encroaching darkness. In the depths of his delirium, he spoke. The words were fractured, torn from him in a voice raw with anguish. He spoke of betrayal, of a promise broken, of fire and ruin, and he called out a name that was not hers. Alara, he groaned, the name a wound in itself, spoken with a depth of loss that made Leora's own heart ache in sympathy. Alara, you were sworn to me. A confusing, unwelcome pang of jealousy, sharp and hot, pierced through Leora's fatigue. She was a fool. This man had a life, a past, a woman he cried out for in his darkest hour. She was merely a temporary harbor, a healer tending to a stranger. She dismissed the feeling as quickly as it came, her focus narrowing once more on the task at hand, his survival. For 3 days and 3 nights, the fever raged. Liora slept in snatches in her chair, her head nodding forward until a pained cry from the pallet would jolt her awake. In a rare moment of stillness, his eyes, a startlingly intense gray that seemed to hold the storm clouds within them, flickered open and focused on her. The delirium receded for a fleeting second, replaced by a flicker of pure, lucid confusion. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice a rough, broken thing. Liora leaned closer, her hand hovering near his forehead. "I am Liora," she replied softly, her voice a gentle anchor in his sea of pain. "You are safe here." His eyes held hers for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before the fever pulled him back under. Then, on the 4th morning, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the cottage window, the fever broke. It receded not like a storm, but like a tide, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weakness and a landscape of exhaustion. Lucien's recovery began, but it was a slow, arduous journey. He was a man accustomed to strength and command, and he chafed at his own helplessness. The frustration was a constant, simmering anger in his eyes. He claimed his memory was hazy, a fog of battle and pain, with no clear recollection of his name or his past. Liora sensed it was a half-truth, a wall he was building to protect himself, and perhaps to protect her. She did not push. Instead, she continued to care for him, her presence a constant, calming influence in the small cottage. She would help him sit up, his back propped against a pile of her softest blankets. She would feed him nourishing broths and stews, watching as strength slowly, painstakingly, returned to his limbs. They began to talk, their conversations filling the quiet spaces between the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of her concoctions. He remained guarded, a fortress of a man, speaking little of himself, but he was a keen observer, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He asked about her, his questions precise and insightful. He wanted to know about her herbs, the properties of each plant, the stories behind her remedies. He listened with an intensity that made her feel as though her small, simple life was a fascinating tale. One afternoon, as she was changing the dressing on his side, he watched her deft, gentle movements. "You have a gentle touch for a battlefield scavenger," he murmured, his voice still rough but stronger now. Liora didn't look up from her work, her fingers carefully cleaning the healing wound. "It is a healer's touch," she corrected him softly, "and I am no scavenger. I save what can be saved." He was silent for a long time after that, but his gaze on her was different, softer, tinged with a respect he had not shown before. The cottage, which had always felt perfectly suited to her, now seemed to shrink around his presence. His large frame, even weakened, looked out of place in her small wooden chair. The scent of her cooking, the familiar aroma of rosemary and thyme, now mingled with the scent of him, a masculine scent of leather and iron, and something wilder, something that spoke of forests and mountains and open skies. As Lucien's strength returned, so too did glimpses of the man he truly was. The weakness fell away like a shed skin, revealing a core of unyielding authority. He was observant and fiercely intelligent, his mind as sharp as any blade. He began to help her with small tasks around the cottage, his movements, once stiff with pain, becoming fluid and powerful again. He would chop wood with a clean, efficient economy of motion that spoke of immense physical strength held in perfect control. He would listen to her talk about the skirmishes in the valley, and with a few quiet questions, he would reveal a startling, innate understanding of strategy and tactics, seeing patterns she had never noticed. The mystery of him deepened, but he was no longer just a patient. He was becoming a partner in her solitude. The true measure of the man, however, was revealed by a rare visitor. A traveling merchant, a burly, unpleasant man named Jorlan, stopped at her cottage one afternoon, his cart laden with cheap trinkets and shoddy goods. He was a rare sight in this part of the woods, and Liora, needing to replenish her supply of salt, greeted him warily. Jorlan's eyes roamed her cottage with a greedy, assessing gaze, and he quickly became aggressive, demanding she trade her valuable herbal remedies for a pittance. He tried to intimidate her, his voice rising, his bulk crowding her in her own doorway. "A lonely woman like you needs protection," he sneered, his hand reaching out to grab a bundle of dried lavender. "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." Before Liora could react, a quiet voice cut through the air from the shadows of the cottage. "That is enough." It was Lucien. He was leaning against the door frame, appearing for all the world like a man still recovering from a grave injury. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't moved a muscle, but the effect was instantaneous. Jorlan froze, his hand dropping as if stung. Lucien's gray eyes, cold and hard as flint, were fixed on the merchant. There was no anger in his gaze, just a flat, absolute certainty, a chilling promise of violence that was more terrifying than any overt threat. "You will trade the lady what she requires," Lucien said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of command. "You will give her a fair price, and then you will leave and never return." The merchant, who had been puffing out his chest moments before, seemed to shrink. He stammered an apology, his face pale with sweat. The transaction was completed in a hurried, fearful silence. Jorlan practically threw a bag of salt at Liora, refused any payment, and scrambled back to his cart, whipping his horse into a panicked retreat. He fled as if the very hounds of hell were at his heels. Liora stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She was both frightened and utterly fascinated. She had just witnessed the dangerous power that lurked beneath Lucien's quiet exterior. It was a stark, terrifying reminder that this man was not a simple soldier. What kind of life had he led, she wondered, that he could command such primal fear so effortlessly, without so much as raising his voice? The incident with the merchant, though unsettling, shifted something between them. The pretense of him being just a simple, wounded man had been stripped away, and in its place, a more honest, more complex connection began to form. One evening, as a soft rain pattered against the roof and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, Liora found herself speaking of her parents. She told him about their skill as healers, their love for the forest, and the sudden, devastating fever that had taken them both, leaving her utterly alone. It was the first time she had ever spoken of her loneliness to another soul, the words feeling strange and fragile in the air. She expected him to offer simple platitudes, the kind of empty comfort most people gave. But Lucien just listened, his intense gaze never leaving her face, his silence a vessel for her grief. When she had finished, her voice thick with unshed tears, he did not offer pity. Instead, he offered a piece of himself. "Loneliness is a heavy cloak," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't speak of his own past, not directly, but he spoke of the crushing burden of leadership, of the isolation that comes from making decisions that cost lives. He spoke of the pain of betrayal, of trusting someone completely only to have that trust shattered, leaving a wound far deeper than any sword could inflict. He didn't name names, he didn't speak of crowns or kingdoms, but Liora understood. She heard the echo of his fevered cries, of the name Ilara, and she knew he was speaking of the source of his deepest pain. In that moment, their bond deepened, moving beyond that of a patient and his healer. They were two lonely souls, two people marked by loss, finding a rare, unexpected solace in each other's company. The attraction that had simmered beneath the surface, a dangerous, unspoken current, now became a palpable presence in the small cottage. Liora found herself falling for the man, not the mystery he represented. She was falling for his quiet strength, his surprising gentleness, the sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. A foolish, dangerous hope began to take root in her heart. She started to hope that the fog over his memory would never lift, that his past would remain a closed book, so that he might stay here, with her, in the quiet peace of the cottage. Weeks melted into a golden, late summer haze. The oppressive heat of the season began to yield to the crisp, clean air of early autumn, and the leaves at the edges of the whisperwood were just beginning to blush with shades of amber and crimson. Inside the cottage, a comfortable domestic rhythm had taken root, as natural and steady as the changing seasons outside. Lucien, as she still called him in the quiet of her heart, was healed. The deep, angry gash in his side, a wound that had almost claimed his life, was now a puckered silver scar, a stark testament to her skill and his own formidable resilience. He no longer leaned on the furniture or moved with the pained stiffness of an invalid. His full strength had returned, and with it, a vitality that seemed to make the small cottage hum with a new energy. He walked without pain, his stride long and confident, and the haunted, feverish look in his eyes had been replaced by a clear, steady gaze that often rested on her with an unnerving intensity. They fell into a pattern of shared days. He would rise with the sun, the sound of his axe splitting firewood, a sharp, rhythmic percussion in the morning stillness. He helped her tend her garden, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he weeded the beds or turned the soil. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements a practiced dance, their shared purpose, weaving a bond between them that needed no words. One sunny afternoon, the air warm and smelling of rich earth and decaying leaves, they were in the garden, harvesting the last of the season's bounty. Liora was reaching for a sprig of late-blooming rosemary when her fingers brushed against his as he reached for the same pruning shears. The contact was fleeting, a spark of warmth against her skin, but it sent a jolt through her entire body. The air crackled, charged with a sudden, potent emotion that had been simmering just beneath the surface of their quiet lives for weeks. He froze, his hand hovering over hers. Liora looked up, her breath catching in her throat. He was looking at her, his intense gray eyes, which she had once compared to storm clouds, now softened with an emotion she had never seen in them before. It was a look of profound gratitude, of deep, aching tenderness, and something more, something that made her heart beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. He said, his voice a low, soft rumble that was for her alone. "This time with you, in this place, it has been the most peaceful of my life." He confessed it not as a grand declaration, but as a simple, undeniable truth, the words holding the weight of a man who had known very little peace. He leaned in, his movement hesitant, as if asking a question he was afraid to voice. Leora's world narrowed to the space between them, to the scent of rosemary on his skin and the warmth of his breath. Then, he closed the distance and his lips met hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a soft, gentle exploration, as if he were tasting a rare and precious vintage. It was a kiss of gratitude, of solace, of two lonely souls finding a harbor in one another. Liora, who had dreamed of this moment in the secret, hopeful corners of her heart, felt a wave of pure, unadulterated joy wash over her. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. Her response, her own pent-up longing and affection, seemed to break a dam within him. The kiss deepened, becoming a torrent of emotion, a desperate, hungry claiming that spoke of weeks of unspoken desire. It was a kiss that promised a future she had dared to hope for, a future where he would stay, where the man she had named Lucien would be hers, and the mystery of his past would remain forever shrouded in fog. Her heart soared, light and free, convinced in that perfect sun-drenched moment that their quiet life together was only just beginning. The idyllic moment, so fragile and so perfect, was shattered. The sound came first, an alien intrusion into the peaceful quiet of their world. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of shod hooves on soft earth, the metallic jingle of mail armor and bridles, a sound of iron and war that had no place in her sanctuary. Liora pulled back from the kiss, her heart still soaring, her mind slow to register the disruption. Lucien, however, went rigid in an instant. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a hard, wary alertness. He pushed her gently behind him, his body becoming a shield, his gaze fixed on the edge of the clearing. A group of 5 knights, clad from head to toe in gleaming, black steel armor, rode into view. They moved as one, their discipline absolute, their presence radiating a cold, disciplined menace that seemed to suck the very warmth from the afternoon sun. The sigil of a snarling wolf's head was emblazoned on their breastplates and shields, a mark of savage, predatory power. They dismounted with a grim efficiency, their movements economical and precise. Their leader, a tall, battle-scarred man with a stern face and cold, assessing eyes, strode forward. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the cottage, the garden, and Liora, his expression unreadable. Then, his eyes landed on Lucien, and his stern demeanor cracked. His eyes widened in shock, a shock that was quickly replaced by a wave of immense, overwhelming relief. He took 3 more steps forward and then, to Leora's utter astonishment, he dropped to one knee in the dirt of her garden, bowing his head in a gesture of profound fealty. "My king," the knight said, his voice rough with emotion, "we feared you were lost." The words struck Liora with the force of a physical blow. "King!" The blood drained from her face, and a roaring sound filled her ears. She looked from the kneeling, armored giant to the man standing before her. The man she had just kissed. The man she loved. Her mind reeled, unable to process the impossible reality crashing down upon her. The world tilted on its axis, the familiar lines of her garden, her cottage, her life, suddenly seeming strange and unreal. Lucien's face had hardened into a mask of cold, commanding authority. The gentle, wounded man she had nursed, the quiet companion who had shared her solitude, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a powerful, intimidating figure who seemed to belong to the world of iron and blood the knights had brought with them. "Rise, Kaelin," Lucien said, and his voice was not the one she knew. It was a voice accustomed to command, a voice that tolerated no argument, a voice that was cold and sharp as the edge of a sword. The reports of my demise were, as you see, exaggerated. Liora felt a profound, sickening sense of betrayal and foolishness wash over her. The man she had fallen in love with, the man she had named Lucien, had been a fantasy, a story she had told herself. This powerful, cold stranger, this king, was the reality. Kalen rose to his feet, his relief quickly hardening back into grim duty. He began to speak, his words a torrent of information that further dismantled Liora's world. They had been ambushed in the valley, he explained, by forces loyal to a rival, a powerful nobleman named Lord Valerius. The ambush had been aided by forbidden magic, a sorcerous attack that had scattered the king's personal guard and left him wounded and alone. In the weeks since, Valerius had been making moves at court, spreading rumors of the king's death, suggesting that a new, stronger leader was needed to protect the kingdom. Lucien's return was not just a relief, it was a political necessity, a matter of the utmost urgency. As Kalen spoke, Lucien's attention was absolute. He was no longer in her garden, he was in a throne room, on a battlefield, his mind already moving pieces on a board she couldn't see. He gave sharp, precise orders to his men, his words clipped and efficient. He was a king reclaiming his throne, and Liora, standing to the side in her simple homespun dress, her hands still smelling of rosemary, was utterly invisible to him. Her world had just collapsed, and he hadn't even noticed. When he had finished with his men, he finally turned to her. The tenderness, the passion, the shared peace of moments before might as well have been a dream. His expression was formal, his eyes distant, holding a new kind of conflict she did not understand. "You have my gratitude, Liora," he said, his voice polite, formal, and utterly devastating. "Your kingdom will be rewarded for your service." The words were a slap in the face. My kingdom, service. He was dismissing her, paying her for a job well done, reducing the intimacy, the love, the life they had built together into a simple transaction. A hot, bitter anger surged through her, eclipsing the shock and the hurt. "My kingdom?" she repeated, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and fury. "I am not a subject to be rewarded. I saved a man, not a title." Her defiance seemed to surprise him, a flicker of the man she knew returning to his eyes before being extinguished. Before he could respond, the knight, Kalen, stepped forward, his gaze on Liora cold and pragmatic. He spoke to Lucien, but his words were about her, as if she were an object to be discussed. "Sire," he said, his voice a low, firm rumble, "she cannot remain here. She knows who you are, she has seen your weakness. That makes her a liability, or a target for your enemies." Every word was a hammer blow, sealing her fate. A liability, a target. Kalen was right, and the cold, hard logic of his words was undeniable. Lucien looked at her then, his face a mask of conflict, the king at war with the man. Leaving her here, now that she knew his identity, would be a death sentence. Valerius, or his other enemies, would not hesitate to use her to get to him. The king won the war. "She comes with us," he declared, the decision sounding more like a verdict than an invitation. It was not a question. It was a command. Liora was given no choice. The life she had known was over, packed away in the space of a few heartbeats. While two of the knights stood guard, their armored presence a jarring violation of her home, she was instructed to pack a bag. Her hands shook as she moved through her cottage, the familiar space now feeling alien and confining. She hastily gathered a small bundle of her most essential herbs, the familiar scents of lavender and chamomile, a painful reminder of the peace she had lost. Her salves, her tinctures, her books, her entire life, she had to leave behind. She was no longer the master of her own home, the quiet healer of the Whisperwood. She was a prisoner, her fate decided by a man who had become a stranger. The knights watched her with open suspicion, their eyes following her every move, their expressions making it clear they saw her not as a savior, but as a complication, a commoner who had gotten too close to their king. The cottage, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage she was about to be freed from, only to be put in another. The cold, hard lines of the knight's steel armor and leather clashed with the soft, natural textures of her home, With the worn wood of her table and the soft furs on her bed, it was a visual representation of the two worlds colliding, and her world was being obliterated. As she was led from her home for the last time, a knight holding her arm in a firm, inescapable grip, Lucien approached her. He had shed the simple tunic she had mended for him, and was now clad in a fine, black leather jerkin provided by one of his men. He looked every inch the king, powerful and remote. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes shadowed. "Liora, he began, his voice strained, as if he were trying to find the words to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. But she could not bear to hear them. She could not bear his pity or his excuses. With all the strength she had left, she cut him off, her own voice sharp with the pain of his betrayal. "Save your words, your majesty," she said, the title a bitter poison on her tongue. She pulled her arm from the knight's grasp and mounted the horse they had brought for her without waiting for his help, her back rigid with a pride she did not feel. The love and trust she had felt for him, so vibrant and full of hope only an hour before, had curdled into a cold, bitter resentment. The journey to the castle, to his world, began in a heavy, suffocating silence. The journey was a long, tense affair, each league taking Liora further from the life she knew and deeper into a future she did not want. The silence in their party was a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the jingle of armor. When they finally arrived, it was not to a castle, but to a citadel, a fortress of such staggering scale and brutalist design that it seemed less built by men and more gouged from the very heart of the mountain it was carved into. It was a monument to power and intimidation, its dark stone battlements clawing at the sky, its narrow windows like the eyes of a predator. The royal citadel of Thorne was a stark, terrifying contrast to the gentle, sun-dappled clearing of her cottage. As they passed through the massive iron gates, the echoing clang of their closure sounding like a prison door slamming shut, Liora felt a profound sense of insignificance. The corridors were vast, cold, and echoing, the air thick with the unfamiliar scents of beeswax, polished steel, and old, cold stone. Guards in the same black armor and wolf-head sigils stood like statues in every alcove, their gazes suspicious and dismissive as she was led past. Servants scurried by, their eyes downcast, but not before flicking curious, contemptuous glances at her simple, travel-stained homespun dress. She was an anomaly, a weed in a meticulously cultivated garden of nobility, and she felt every bit of their disdain. Lucien, the man she had known, was gone, swallowed whole by the king he truly was. He was immediately swept away upon their arrival, surrounded by a coterie of grim-faced counselors and military commanders who had been awaiting his return. He did not look back at her, his focus already on the kingdom, on the threat of Valerius, on the heavy burden of his crown. Liora was handed off to a stern-faced handmaiden, a woman whose expression was a mask of pinched disapproval. She was escorted through a labyrinth of corridors to a set of chambers that were more luxurious than anything she could have ever imagined. The bed was draped in velvet, the furniture was carved from dark polished wood, and a fire already crackled in a grand stone fireplace. But the luxury was a mockery. The windows were tall and narrow, barred with ornate ironwork, and the door closed with a heavy, definitive click. It was not a guest room, it was a gilded cage. The handmaiden, whose name was Elspeth, informed her with cold formality that she was to remain there for her own safety. The king would summon her when he was able. Liora was left alone, the silence of the opulent room more deafening than the silence of the forest had ever been. She was a prisoner, and the man who held the key was the same one who had stolen her heart. Days bled into one another, marked only by the changing of the guard outside her door and the silent delivery of her meals. Liora felt her spirit beginning to fray. Finally, she was summoned, not to a private meeting, but to the throne room, to witness the king in his full, terrifying glory. She was made to stand at the side of the great hall, a silent observer, as Lucien stood before his court. This was not the patient she had nursed, nor the quiet companion of her cottage. This was a different man entirely, a ruthless and decisive ruler whose every word carried the weight of absolute power. She watched in growing horror as a captured traitor, one of Lord Valerius's men, was dragged before the throne. The man was young, terrified, and he pleaded for his life, babbling about his family, about being misled. Leora's heart went out to him, her healer's instinct, seeing only a life in peril. But Lucien was unmoved. His face was a mask of cold, hard pragmatism. He listened to the man's pleas without a flicker of emotion, and when the man was finished, he delivered his judgment in a voice that was as cold and sharp as glacial ice. The man was to be executed for treason, his lands forfeit, his family stripped of their name. There was no trial, no mercy, just the swift, brutal justice of an absolute monarch. Liora felt sick. A wave of revulsion and fear washed over her. Was this the real Lucien? The man who had spoken with such pain about the burden of leadership, about the cost of lives? Or was that just another lie, another part of the mask he wore? She questioned everything she had thought she knew about him, every shared moment in the cottage, every soft word, every tender touch. It all felt like a calculated deception now, a means to an end, a way to ensure his survival. The tenderness he had shown her, the peace he claimed to have found with her, it was all a lie, a beautiful, cruel illusion. She felt utterly trapped, a fly caught in a spider's web, and deeply, profoundly alone. The solitude of her cottage had been a choice, a peaceful isolation. This was a crushing, suffocating loneliness, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who despised her, of being bound to a man she no longer recognized. She missed her home, her freedom, the simple, honest life she had led. A dark suspicion began to take root in her heart. He hadn't brought her here to protect her. He had brought her here to control her, to silence the one person who had seen the mighty Alpha King at his weakest, most vulnerable moment. Her presence in the castle did not go unnoticed. She became a curiosity, a whispered scandal, and ultimately, a pawn in the dangerous game of court politics. Lord Valerius, the architect of the ambush that had nearly killed Lucien, made his first public appearance since the king's return. He was everything the rumors claimed: handsome, charismatic, with a smile that was as charming as it was predatory. He came from one of the oldest, most powerful families in the kingdom, and he carried himself with an air of effortless arrogance. He publicly welcomed the king's return, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity as he addressed the court, but his words were laced with a subtle, insidious poison aimed directly at her, and through her, at Lucien. "We are all so relieved to have our king back among us," Valerius declared, his voice carrying through the hushed throne room. He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled nobles before landing on Liora, who stood near the edge of the room, feeling like an insect under a lens. "Though one must wonder," he continued, his tone laced with mock concern, at the company he kept during his convalescence. "A simple village healer. How rustic." The words were a direct, public jab, a calculated insult designed to undermine Lucien's authority by questioning his judgment. The nobles chuckled, a low, cruel sound that echoed in the vast hall. From that moment on, Liora was no longer just an outsider, she was a target. The court, taking its cue from Valerius, treated her with open contempt. Rumors, vicious and imaginative, spread like wildfire. Some whispered she was a witch from the Whisperwood, a sorceress who had ensnared the king with a love potion, her healing arts a cover for dark magic. Others claimed she was a common prostitute, who had stumbled upon the wounded king, and was now using her position to manipulate him for her own gain. The noble ladies of the court were the worst. They would turn their backs on her when she entered a room, their silken gowns rustling in a gesture of collective disdain. They would whisper behind their fans, their eyes glinting with malice, their laughter sharp and cutting. Liora, who had lived her life in quiet solitude, was now exposed to a level of cruelty and social maneuvering she had never imagined. She was completely alone, an island in a sea of hostility, and the man who had brought her into this viper's nest remained a distant, unapproachable figure on a throne of cold stone. Late one night, long after the castle had settled into a restless silence, he finally came. Liora was sitting by the cold hearth in her chambers, staring into the dying embers, when the door opened and Lucien entered, looking weary, the immense weight of his crown visible in the slump of his shoulders and the deep lines etched around his eyes. He had dismissed the guards, and they were truly alone for the first time since their arrival. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a complex mixture of frustration and something else, something she couldn't name. "Liora," he began, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Liora looked up at him, the embers of her own anger, which had been smoldering for days, finally bursting into flame. "Talk?" she asked, her voice bitter and sharp. "About what, Your Majesty? About the traitor you had executed without a trial? Or the fact that I am your prisoner, locked away in this beautiful cage while your court tears me to shreds?" The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of war. A flash of anger, hot and fierce, crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, bone-weary frustration. "I am protecting you," he said, his voice rising, a low, dangerous growl. "Do you have any idea what Valerius would do to you if he found you alone and unprotected? He wouldn't hesitate. He would use you, torture you, anything to destroy me and undermine my rule. Your very existence is a threat to him." Liora rose to her feet, her own anger matching his. "And what are you doing that is so different?" she shot back, her voice trembling with a week's worth of pain and humiliation. "You have locked me away. I am a bird in a cage, a spectacle for your cruel court. The man I cared for, the man who spoke of the burden of his life, he would never have done this. He would have understood." Lucien's jaw clenched, and the anger flashed in his eyes again, brighter this time. "The man you cared for was half dead and hiding," he snarled, taking a step towards her. "This is who I am, Liora. This is the reality of my life. This is what it takes to hold this kingdom together, to protect it from vultures like Valerius. I cannot be the man from the cottage. Not here. That man cannot rule." The argument created a chasm between them, wider and deeper than the valley that separated the castle from her home. His words, meant to make her understand, only confirmed her worst fears. The man she loved was gone, or perhaps he had never existed at all. He was a ghost, a dream she had conjured in the quiet of her cottage. This cold, hard king was the reality. He saw the finality in her eyes, the way her hope extinguished like a snuffed candle. The anger drained out of him, leaving behind only the weary monarch. He turned without another word and left, the heavy door closing behind him, sealing her back in her solitude. Liora stood there for a long time, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She was more alone now than she had ever been in her life, convinced that the love she had felt, the love she thought he had shared, was an illusion that couldn't survive the harsh light of his world. A new resolve hardened within her, cold and clear as ice. She would not be a prisoner. She would not be a pawn. She would find a way to escape this castle, to escape him, and reclaim her life. Desperation was a cold, sharp stone in Liora's gut. Her resolve to escape, forged in the lonely, bitter hours of her confinement, was the only thing that kept the suffocating luxury of her chambers from crushing her spirit. She began to explore, her movements quiet and purposeful. During the day, when the castle was a hive of activity, she would slip from her rooms, using the constant flow of servants as cover. She was not merely wandering, she was hunting, her healer's eyes searching not for herbs, but for weaknesses in the fortress's defenses, for a forgotten postern gate, a little-used passage, a way out. Her search led her to the forgotten corners of the citadel, to dusty, disused wings, where the tapestries were frayed and the air was stale with neglect. It was in one of these forgotten corridors, far from the opulent heart of the castle, that she found it. A heavy, iron-banded oak door, unlocked and slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped not into an escape route but into a place that felt like a ghost of her own life. It was the castle's infirmary. It was a vast, stone-walled room with a high, vaulted ceiling, but it was a place of profound neglect. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting from the grimy windows. Rows of empty cots stood like skeletal remains, their linens yellowed and stiff. A few shelves held jars of discolored liquids and dried, crumbling herbs that had long since lost their potency. It was a place that spoke of a kingdom that prioritized the arts of breaking men over the craft of mending them. Through a door at the back of the infirmary, she found a small, walled garden, open to the sky. It had once been a physician's garden, but it was now a riot of weeds and thorns, a testament to years of abandonment. Yet, beneath the choking overgrowth, life endured. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She saw the familiar serrated leaves of yarrow, a patch of resilient feverfew, and even a struggling silver-leaf plant, its leaves coated in dust but still shimmering faintly. It was a mirror of her own situation, a small pocket of healing potential being choked by a hostile environment. A new purpose, a different kind of defiance, took root in her. If she could not escape the castle, she would carve out a piece of her own world within its walls. She began to work, secretly at first, stealing moments to pull weeds, to turn the soil with a rusted trowel she found, to prune the struggling plants. She found a new rhythm, not of escape, but of reclamation. The work was hard. Her hands, which had grown soft, were soon calloused again. But with every weed she pulled, with every struggling herb she nurtured, she felt a piece of herself returning. She was not just a prisoner, not just the king's rustic mistress, she was a healer. One afternoon, as she was carefully transplanting a patch of chamomile, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat, to see the grim, battle-scarred face of Kalin, the king's second in command. He stood there, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his black armor seeming to absorb the very light around him. He had been watching her, she realized, his expression unreadable. He saw her not as a threat, not as a schemer, but as a master of a craft he did not understand. He had seen her work for days, his initial suspicions slowly giving way to a grudging respect. He saw the order she was creating from chaos, the life she was coaxing from the neglected earth. "The king's enemies see you as a weakness," Kalin said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He was not offering friendship, he was stating a fact, a strategic assessment. A distraction. Prove them wrong. Liora rose slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her simple dress, her fear giving way to a spark of her earlier defiance. "He sees me that way too," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Kalin's gaze was steady, his eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been understanding. "He sees a memory of peace he can no longer afford," the knight corrected her, his words surprisingly insightful. "But what he needs is not peace. What he needs is a weapon. Your knowledge, it could be one." He gestured to the garden, to the herbs she had so carefully tended. He did not see comfort or healing. He saw poison and antidote, weakness and strength. He saw her potential value to his king, and in that, he saw a reason to help her. He granted her official access to the infirmary and, more importantly, to the royal library, a place of ancient texts and forgotten knowledge, giving her the tools to forge the weapon he believed she could become. Weeks later, Liora was forced to attend a royal banquet. Dressed in a gown of dark green silk that Elspeth had laid out for her, she felt like a costume doll, a prop to be displayed. The great hall was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and power, filled with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and expensive perfumes. The air hummed with the laughter and conversation of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, their jewels flashing in the light of 1,000 candles. Liora sat at a table near the dais, a silent, uncomfortable observer. Valerius was there, of course, moving through the crowd with the fluid grace of a panther, his charming smile a mask for the predatory ambition that burned in his eyes. Lucien sat on his throne, a remote, powerful figure, his gaze sweeping the hall, missing nothing. A man at the high table, a loyal general named Lord Gregor, a friend of Lucien's with a booming laugh and a face like a friendly bulldog, suddenly choked. His goblet clattered to the floor, and he slumped forward, his face contorting in agony. A terrible, writhing spasm seized his body, and he crashed to the floor, his limbs flailing. Panic erupted. Women screamed. The court physicians, a gaggle of pompous elderly men in velvet robes, rushed to the general's side. They fluttered around him, offering conflicting diagnoses, one declaring it a fatal seizure, another a stroke of apoplexy. They were more concerned with their own reputations than with the dying man at their feet. Liora, who had been frozen in shock, felt a jolt of recognition. The symptoms, the sudden, violent convulsions, the purplish tint to the man's lips, she had seen them before, not in a patient, but on the brittle, yellowed pages of an ancient text Kalin had procured for her from the library. She pushed back her chair and rushed to the general's side, ignoring the gasps of the nobles around her. "It's poison," she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Your remedies will do nothing. I need silverwood moss and crushed moon petal now." The chief physician, a man with a face like a sour plum, scoffed at her. "This is a malady of the humors, not some peasant poison." But Kaelin, who stood guard near the throne, had seen the certainty in her eyes. He trusted his gut, and he trusted the skill he had witnessed in the garden. "Get her what she needs," he bellowed at the stunned guards, his voice the roar of a lion. "Now!" The ingredients were brought, and Liora knelt on the cold stone floor, her silk gown forgotten. She worked with a frantic, focused intensity, crushing the moss and petals together with a small amount of wine from a nearby flagon, creating a thick, dark paste. The entire hall watched in a tense, breathless silence. Lucien had risen from his throne, his knuckles white where he gripped its arm, his gaze fixed on her, a storm of emotions in his eyes. With Kaelin's help, Liora forced the general's jaw open and administered the antidote, her touch firm and sure. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The general lay still, his breathing shallow, his life seemingly extinguished. The head physician sneered, ready to pronounce her a failure. Then, Gregor's body gave a final, violent shudder, and he took a deep, ragged breath. The ghastly purple color began to recede from his face, replaced by a deathly pallor, but it was the pallor of life, not death. A collective sigh of relief swept through the hall. Liora had done it. She had saved him. In the aftermath of the banquet, the whispers in the castle changed. Liora was no longer the king's commoner mistress, a rustic distraction. She was the woman who had saved his most loyal general, the healer whose knowledge surpassed that of the royal physicians. The contempt in the eyes of the court was replaced by a new emotion, a mixture of awe and fear. She had become a power in her own right, an unknown quantity, and therefore a dangerous one. Valerius, watching from the shadows, was furious. His plan had been thwarted, and by her of all people, the very person he had dismissed as an insignificant peasant. Later that night, Lucien summoned her to his private solar. The cold formality that had defined their interactions was gone, replaced by a raw, undisguised awe and a deep, renewed respect. He stood by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on his face, and for the first time since their arrival, she saw a glimpse of the man from the cottage in the eyes of the king. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice quiet, filled with a genuine wonder that stripped away the layers of his royal authority. Liora met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. She was no longer the frightened, heartbroken girl who had arrived at this castle. She had found her footing, her strength. "I am a healer," she said, her voice resonating with a simple, profound truth. "It is what I do. It is who I am. It is the woman you brought from the cottage." The words hung in the air, a bridge between their two worlds, a declaration that the woman he had tried to hide and the power he now admired were one and the same. A wave of profound regret washed over Lucien's face. He took a step towards her, his expression stripped bare, showing only the vulnerability of a man admitting his own blindness. "I was wrong, Liora," he said, his voice thick with a pain that was not physical but emotional. "I was a fool. I tried to protect you by caging you, by hiding you away. But your strength, your spirit, it isn't something to be hidden. It's something to be wielded. I see that now." He reached out, his hand hesitating before gently touching her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "I need you," he confessed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Not as a memory of peace I can look back on. I need you here, now, by my side." It was the apology she had longed for, the acknowledgement she had craved. He was asking for her forgiveness, not as a king demanding fealty, but as a man asking for a second chance. Seeing the raw sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he was offering her, the ice around her heart finally began to melt. She granted him her forgiveness, not with words, but by leaning into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. Their bond, once shattered, was reforged in the fire of that moment, stronger now because it was based not on a fragile, idyllic dream, but on a shared, dangerous reality and a profound, mutual respect. Lucien and Kaelin knew that Valerius, having failed once, would only become more desperate, more dangerous. They convened a secret council in the king's solar, a council of 3. This time, Liora was not a bystander. She was a participant, her chair drawn up to the table alongside the king and his most trusted commander. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was a strategist now, her sharp mind and unique knowledge a vital asset. They needed a way to expose Valerius, to force his hand in a way that would leave no doubt of his treason in the eyes of the court. "He believes you are still my primary weakness," Lucien said, his gaze resting on Liora, no longer with fear for her safety, but with a new, calculating respect. "We can use that." The idea of using her as bait was a dangerous one, a serpent coiling in the center of the room. But this time, Liora was not a pawn to be sacrificed. She was a player in the game. She looked from Lucien's determined face to Kaelin's grim one and nodded, a cold resolve settling within her. She was afraid, but she would not let fear rule her. She would use the role they had cast for her, the role of the weak, manipulative mistress, and turn it into a weapon. It was Liora herself who devised the most crucial part of the plan. "He used poison to try and remove a loyal man," she said, her voice steady. "We will use the fear of sickness to remove a traitor." She suggested a way to feign a deadly illness for Lucien, using her knowledge of a rare, non-lethal herb that could mimic the symptoms of the dreaded Red Plague, a disease that had ravaged the kingdom a generation ago. It was a brilliant, audacious plan, turning the court's superstitious fear of her supposed witchcraft into the very tool of Valerius's undoing. It was a demonstration of her strategic mind and her unwavering commitment to their shared cause. The trap was set, a complex, dangerous mechanism of their own making, and as they finalized the details, a sense of grim anticipation settled over the 3 of them. They were no longer just fighting a political rival, they were hunting a predator, and Liora, the gentle healer, was now the one who would help bait the trap. The plan was set in motion in the quiet stillness of the king's chambers, a single candle burning against the encroaching night. Leora's hand was steady as she held the small vial containing the herbal concoction. It was a complex mixture, harmless, but designed to mimic the most terrifying symptoms of the Red Plague. She brought the vial to Lucien's lips, her eyes meeting his over the rim. In his gaze, she saw no fear, only an absolute, unwavering trust in her and in their plan. He drank the bitter liquid without hesitation, then lay back against the pillows, his hand finding hers in the dim light. The wait was the hardest part. Within the hour, the herbs began their work. A deathly pallor crept over Lucien's features, his skin becoming clammy and cool to the touch. His breathing grew shallow, each breath a faint, almost imperceptible flutter in his chest. Liora, playing her part, let out a cry of alarm that was only half feigned, the sight of him so close to the state she had found him in on the battlefield sending a genuine spear of fear through her heart. Panic, swift and venomous, swept through the castle. The royal physicians, summoned from their beds, descended on the king's chambers in a flurry of velvet robes and panicked whispers. They found their king appearing deathly ill, beyond the reach of their limited knowledge. They declared him beyond saving, their pronouncements a mixture of self-important gravity and genuine terror. The news spread like a plague itself, from the royal chambers to the great hall, down through the kitchens and into the barracks. The king was dying. The whispers turned to cries, the order of the citadel dissolving into chaos. Into this maelstrom of fear and uncertainty, Lord Valerius strode as if he were the calm at the center of the storm. He arrived in the throne room with his personal contingent of guards, their silver and black livery a stark contrast to the royal wolf sigil. He moved with a triumphant, predatory grace, his face a mask of solemn concern that fooled no one who knew how to look. He ascended the dais, standing just below the throne where Lucien had been carefully placed, his seemingly lifeless body a prop in their grand theater. Valerius turned to the terrified assembled court. "The Alpha bloodline has grown weak," he declared, his voice ringing with false sorrow and naked ambition. "It has been tainted by this peasant girl, this forest witch, who brought a curse upon our king and our court. I will restore our strength. I will lead us back to glory. As is my right, I proclaim myself the new Alpha King." He basked in the stunned silence of the court, his victory so close he could taste it. He turned, a smug, proprietary smile on his lips, to look upon the man he had vanquished. And as he did, the dead king's eyes snapped open. They were not the dull, lifeless eyes of a dying man. They were the eyes of a predator, blazing with a cold, righteous fury. Lucien rose from the throne, not a sick man, but a king in the fullness of his power, his body radiating a terrifying vitality. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Valerius stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "My blood is not weak, Valerius." Lucien's voice boomed through the hall, each word a hammer blow of judgment. "But your loyalty is non-existent." On his words, the heavy tapestries lining the walls of the throne room were thrown aside. From hidden alcoves and concealed doorways, Kalen and 24 of the royal guard emerged, their black steel armor gleaming, their swords drawn. They moved with a silent, deadly efficiency, surrounding Valerius and his men in a ring of inescapable steel. The trap was sprung. Valerius, his face ashen, his mind reeling from the sudden, catastrophic reversal, acted on pure, desperate instinct. He was standing near Liora, who had been positioned close to the throne as part of the ruse. In a flash of movement, he grabbed her, pulling her back against his chest and pressing the cold steel of a dagger to her throat. "Call them off, Thorne," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Call them off, or she dies. Your weakness will still be your undoing." But Liora was not the frightened girl from the cottage, nor the humiliated prisoner. She was a weapon, honed and ready. As Valerius's arm tightened around her, she was already moving. She stomped down, hard, with the reinforced heel of her boot onto Valerius's instep, a simple but brutally effective move Kalen had drilled into her. The nobleman grunted in pain, his grip faltering for a split second. It was all she needed. She drove her elbow back into his ribs with all her strength, and as he gasped, she broke free. In the same fluid motion, she reached into a small pouch concealed in her sleeve, her fingers closing around a small silk packet. She spun and threw its contents, a fine powder of ground hot peppers and allergenic pollen, directly into Valerius's face. He screamed, a high, agonized sound, dropping his dagger to claw at his eyes as the powder blinded him with excruciating pain. In that moment of Valerius's weakness, Lucien moved. He descended the steps of the dais, not like a man, but like an avalanche, a blur of controlled fury. The fight, if it could be called that, was short and brutal. It was not a brawl, it was a formal, ritualistic assertion of dominance. Lucien met Valerius's wild, blind swings with a cold, precise economy of motion. He disarmed the screaming nobleman with a sharp twist of the wrist, the dagger clattering on the stone floor. He did not kill him. Instead, he delivered a single, devastating blow to Valerius's jaw, a strike that sent the traitor crashing to the floor, unconscious. The challenge was over. The Alpha King had defended his throne. Lucien stood over the fallen form of his rival, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from the sheer force of his rage. The court watched, expecting a swift, bloody execution. But Lucien, his eyes finding Liora's across the room, made a different choice. "He is stripped of his titles, his lands, and his name," Lucien declared, his voice resonating with absolute authority. "He is to be exiled to the barren isles of the north. Let him live out his days with nothing but his treason for company." It was a fate worse than death for a man like Valerius, a calculated act of mercy that demonstrated a new kind of strength, a strength tempered by Liora's influence. Then, ignoring the gasps of the court, ignoring the kneeling form of Kalen, ignoring the entire world, Lucien went straight to Liora. He crossed the throne room in 3 long strides and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. The relief in his gaze was so profound, so raw, it stole her breath away. The king was gone, and in his place was only the man, her Lucien. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that humbled him, that stripped away all his power and left only his heart. Again. Liora placed her hands over his, her own heart overflowing with a love that had survived fire and betrayal and had been forged into something unbreakable. We saved each other, she replied, her voice soft but sure. In the stunned silence of the throne room, Lucien kept his hands on Leora's face, his gaze locked with hers. He then turned, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her to stand proudly by his side. He faced his court, not as a solitary ruler, but as one half of a whole. You have all witnessed the events of these past weeks, he began, his voice calm now, but carrying a new weight, a new wisdom. You have seen the strength of steel and the cunning of strategy, but today, you have also seen the power of a healer's knowledge and the courage of a loyal heart. He looked down at Liora, his expression full of a love and admiration that was plain for all to see. For too long, this kingdom has been ruled by fear and by the sword alone. We have valued power over compassion and strength over wisdom. That era ends today. He raised his voice, his declaration echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. Liora of the Whisperwood, the woman you see beside me, is not my weakness. She is my counsel, she is my heart, and she is your queen. The declaration sent a shockwave of astonishment through the assembled nobles. A queen from the common folk, a healer on the throne. It was unprecedented, unthinkable. Murmurs of disbelief and protest began to ripple through the crowd. But before they could grow, Kalen, the grim-faced commander, the embodiment of the old guard, took a step forward. He went down on one knee, his head bowed, his sword laid flat on the ground before them. He knelt not just to his king, but to his queen as well. One by one, the other royal guards followed his lead, their armor creaking as they knelt in silent fealty. Seeing the unwavering loyalty of the king's most elite warriors, the nobles, their protests dying in their throats, slowly, reluctantly, began to kneel as well. They knelt to their Alpha King and to the healer who had become his strength. Months later, life in the citadel had found a new balance, a new rhythm. The fear that had once permeated its stone corridors had been replaced by a sense of hope and renewal. Liora, now Queen Liora, had not abandoned her roots. She had transformed the castle's neglected infirmary into a true center for healing and learning. It was now a bustling place, filled with light and the fragrant scent of herbs, where young apprentices, noble and commoner alike, came to learn her craft. She had brought the wisdom of the forest into the heart of the mountain, teaching that the greatest strength was not in the power to break, but in the knowledge of how to mend. The final scene of their turbulent story unfolded not in a throne room, but in a garden. On the highest tier of the citadel, exposed to the sun and sky, Liora had cultivated a garden that mirrored the one she had left behind. It was filled with herbs from her cottage, their familiar scents a constant, gentle reminder of where she had come from. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Lucien came to her there, shedding the trappings of his kingship for the simple comfort of her presence. He was no longer just the Alpha King, and she was no longer just the simple healer. They were partners, their lives, their strengths, their futures, inextricably intertwined. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as they watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the distant peaks. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" she asked softly, her head resting against his chest. "The man in the cottage?" Lucien smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached his eyes. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I have the man and the king right here," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "And I have my peace, because you are my home, whether in a cottage or a castle." Their love, forged in blood and tempered by loyalty, had not only saved them but had set their kingdom on a new, more hopeful path. It was a testament that the greatest strength is not in the power to devour, but in the courage to heal. A new beginning for a king, a queen, and a kingdom reborn.